Henrik Dalström's cabin glowed warm through gaps in the gable wall that every trapper in the Wyoming Territory called pointless. What those gaps did on the coldest night of 1842 would change how frontier cabins were built across the entire Rocky Mountain region. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The thermometer outside the cabin read -40 degrees Fahrenheit when Ronan Fraser stopped shivering. That was the moment Henrik Dalström knew his partner was dying. It was February 9th, 1841, in the Wind River Range of the Wyoming Territory, and the winter had turned savage in ways that even veteran mountain men found difficult to survive. Henrik and Ronan had been trapping partners for 3 years, working the beaver streams that fed into the Popo-Agie River. They were competent, careful, and their cabin was built exactly as every experienced trapper recommended. Solid log construction with every gap chinked tight, a sturdy door that sealed completely, oiled canvas over the single window, and a stone fireplace that drew well and produced substantial heat. The cold front had arrived 2 days earlier, dropping temperatures to levels that made traveling dangerous and outdoor work impossible. Henrik and Ronan had retreated to their cabin with adequate supplies, confident they could wait out the weather. The fireplace roared constantly. Henrik fed it split pine and aspen, maintaining flames that made the stones glow with heat. The interior should have been comfortable, or at least survivable. Instead, something was profoundly wrong. The walls dripped with moisture. Condensation formed on every surface, running down the logs in streams that pooled on the dirt floor. Their blankets were damp. The air felt thick and cold, despite the fire burning less than 8 feet away. Henrik noticed it first on the second day. The heat from the fire rose toward the roof, but instead of warming the cabin, it seemed to disappear into the logs overhead. The ceiling logs were covered in frost on the interior surface. Frozen condensation coated the underside of the roof, crystals of ice growing thicker as warm, moist air from the fire and from their breathing rose and immediately froze against the cold wood. Ronan developed a cough on the evening of the 8th. By morning, he was feverish. By afternoon, he was incoherent. Henrik kept the fire blazing, wrapped Ronan in every blanket they owned, tried to force warm broth into him. Nothing helped. The cabin was a trap. It held them inside, but it couldn't keep them warm. The heat escaped somewhere, somehow, despite every gap being sealed. The moisture their bodies produced, the steam from cooking, the humidity from the fire, all of it rose and froze overhead, creating a layer of ice that actually conducted heat out of the cabin faster than the fireplace could replace it. Ronan Fraser died at 8 o'clock in the evening on February 9th, 1841. He was 32 years old. Henrik sat beside his partner's body through the night, feeding the useless fire, watching condensation drip from the ceiling, and thinking about heat, where it went, how it moved, why a cabin that should have protected them had failed so completely. Henrik buried Ronan on a hillside above their camp 3 days later when the temperature finally rose enough to make digging possible. He marked the grave with stones and spent the rest of that day walking through the winter landscape, looking at cabins. Not his own anymore, but every trapper shelter within 10 miles. He visited Thomas Whitmore's camp first, finding the man inside tending his fire. Henrik asked to examine the cabin's interior. Whitmore thought it was a strange request, but allowed it. Henrik studied the ceiling logs carefully. They were covered in frost, identical to his own cabin. Moisture dripped from the roof beams, creating damp patches on Whitmore's bedding and supplies. Whitmore shrugged when Henrik pointed it out. "Every cabin did that in winter," he explained. "It was normal. You built a big fire, accepted the dampness, and survived. That was mountain life." Henrik visited 4 more trappers over the following week. Robert Ashford's cabin, situated on a creek 12 miles south, showed the same pattern. Ice coating the interior roof, condensation running down walls despite being chinked tight. Ashford had actually tried to solve the problem by sealing his cabin even more thoroughly, packing additional mud and moss into every microscopic gap. The result was worse condensation, not less. His blankets were soaked. His food supplies showed mold from the constant dampness. A pattern emerged that was so universal, Henrik wondered why no one questioned it. Every single cabin he examined lost heat through the roof area, and every single cabin trapped moisture that froze overhead and dripped back down. Trappers accepted this as inevitable, the price of winter survival. They built bigger fires, used more wood, tolerated the dampness, and sometimes they died anyway when the cold was severe enough. Henrik realized something during those weeks that changed his entire understanding of cabin construction. The problem wasn't lack of heat, it was where the heat went. Warm air rose. That was simple physics that every child understood. Fire heated air. Hot air was lighter than cold air, so it climbed upward. In a sealed cabin, that warm air had nowhere to go except up against the coldest part of the structure, the roof logs that were in direct contact with outside temperatures of 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. The warm air hit those frozen logs and immediately condensed. Water vapor in the air turned to liquid, then to ice. That ice actually conducted heat out of the cabin more efficiently than wood alone. The cabin became a perfect machine for wasting heat. You burned wood to create warmth. The warmth rose and condensed. The condensation froze. The ice pulled even more heat out of the interior, and you burned more wood, trying to compensate. The cycle was self-defeating. Henrik spent hours thinking about how to break it. The obvious solution, sealing the cabin tighter, adding more insulation, blocking drafts, was exactly wrong. That trapped more moisture and made condensation worse. What if the solution was the opposite? What if you needed to let heat escape, but in a controlled way that actually kept the cabin warmer? Spring arrived in late April 1842, bringing the thaw that turned mountain streams into torrents and made trap lines productive again. Henrik worked his lines mechanically, collecting beaver pelts with the efficiency of experience, but without enthusiasm. His mind stayed fixed on the problem of heat and condensation. He processed his winter catch and prepared for the journey to Fort Bridger in early June, where trappers gathered to sell furs and resupply for the next season. The fort was located on Black's Fork of the Green River, a major trading post that served the mountain men working throughout the region. Most trappers arrived at the fort, sold their pelts, bought powder and lead and coffee, spent 3 days drinking and gambling, then returned to the mountains. Henrik sold his furs for a decent profit, bought his basic supplies, then spent 2 weeks studying buildings. Fort Bridger had structures built by men with actual carpentry training, not just wilderness improvisation. Henrik examined the barracks, the trading post, the smithy, and the storage buildings. He watched how different structures handled heat and moisture. The blacksmith's forge fascinated him particularly. The smith had built a ventilation system above his workspace, a hood that captured rising smoke and hot air and channeled it outside through a wooden vent. The key detail Henrik noticed was that the vent wasn't sealed solid. It had gaps, deliberate openings that allowed air to flow while preventing rain from entering directly. Henrik spent an entire afternoon watching the forge operation. Hot air rose from the fire and metalwork, traveled up into the hood, and escaped through the vented opening. But the workshop stayed warmer than outside temperature despite this apparent heat loss. Henrik asked the blacksmith about it. The man explained that moving the hottest air out actually helped because it prevented moisture buildup. Dry heat was more effective than damp heat. If you trapped all the hot air with no escape, you got condensation that made everything worse. Henrik understood immediately. The principle applied to cabins. You needed to let the rising warm air go somewhere, but in a way that didn't create drafts in the living space. He examined the fort's storage building next, a large structure used for keeping trade goods dry through winter. The building had an unusual feature, a double-wall construction on the gable ends, with the inner wall solid and the outer wall having small gaps between boards. Henrik asked about it. The post carpenter explained it was an old technique from the East, used in ice houses and root cellars. The air gap between walls provided insulation. Dead air, he called it. Air that couldn't move acted as a barrier against temperature transfer. Henrik bought supplies he hadn't planned on purchasing. Extra lumber, more than a single trapper would normally need. Measuring tools, a plumb line, a carpenter's square, nails, which were expensive on the frontier. The other trappers thought he was building a trading post or planning to settle permanently. Henrik didn't explain his intentions. He loaded his supplies and returned to the mountains with a theory that made no sense to conventional thinking, but perfect sense to him. Henrik selected a new cabin site in late June 1842, abandoning the location where Ronan had died. The new spot sat on elevated ground with good drainage, a clear view of approaching threats, and access to a creek 50 yards downslope. Hauling water would be more work, but the location provided advantages that outweighed convenience. He began construction using methods every trapper would recognize. Foundation stones leveled carefully, wall logs selected for straightness and uniform diameter, corner notching done with precision. The work progressed normally for the first 3 weeks. Robert Ashford visited during the second week, riding past on his way to check trap lines. He stopped to observe Henrik's progress and nodded approvingly. The cabin was shaping up well, built with obvious care and solid technique. Ashford offered to help with the roof raising, a task that typically required 2 men. Henrik accepted, and they spent a day positioning ridge poles and roof beams. The structure looked conventional, exactly like dozens of other mountain cabins scattered throughout the territory. Then, Henrik began work on the gable ends, and everything changed. Standard practice called for filling the triangular gable space with either solid log sections or vertical planking, sealed tight to prevent heat loss and weather penetration. Henrik built something different. He started by constructing an inner gable wall, a solid barrier of tight-fitted logs that sealed the living space completely. This inner wall was finished carefully, chinked thoroughly, creating an airtight boundary between the cabin interior and the gable space above. Then he began the outer gable construction, and that was when Robert Ashford rode past again and stopped to stare. Henrik was installing horizontal logs across the outer gable frame, but he wasn't fitting them tightly together. He was leaving gaps, deliberate, measured gaps of exactly 3 inches between each log. Ashford dismounted and walked closer, certain he was misunderstanding what he saw. Henrik was creating an outer gable wall that was essentially a series of logs with open spaces between them, like horizontal fence rails rather than a solid wall. The gaps ran the entire width of the gable, allowing clear sight through to the inner wall behind. Ashford asked what Henrik was doing. Henrik explained the air gap system, the buffer zone between inner and outer gable walls, the principle of trapping warm rising air to create insulation. Ashford listened, frowned, and then laughed. Henrik was building a cabin that let heat escape directly out the top. The gaps defeated the entire purpose of a roof. Warm air would pour straight through those openings into the cold. Henrik tried to explain that the air would be trapped in the buffer zone between walls, that dead air acted as insulation, that the system would prevent condensation while maintaining heat. Ashford shook his head, still smiling. He'd seen a lot of strange ideas in the mountains, but this was among the strangest. Henrik was welcome to freeze come winter. Henrik spent August completing the air gap system with methodical precision. Each horizontal log in the outer gable was measured, positioned, and secured with exact 3-inch spacing between pieces. The buffer zone between the inner solid wall and the outer gapped wall measured 8 inches at the base, tapering to 6 inches at the peak following the triangular geometry of the gable. The consistency mattered. Uneven gaps would create unpredictable airflow patterns. Henrik understood that controlling air movement was the key to making the system work. He used a measuring stick he had cut specifically for this purpose, checking each gap before securing the logs permanently. Robert Ashford returned twice more during construction, each time bringing another trapper with him to see the peculiar cabin. By late August, word had spread through the scattered mountain community. Dalström was building a cabin with holes in it. The story grew with each retelling. Some trappers heard he had lost his mind after his partner's death. Others thought he was drunk during construction and made mistakes he was too stubborn to fix. A few believed he simply didn't know proper building techniques and was improvising badly. Henrik heard the talk when he visited the trading post at South Pass in early September to purchase final supplies. Men he had known for years made jokes about his unfinished cabin. One asked if he planned to complete the gable before winter or just leave it open. Another suggested Henrik might want to hang canvas over the gaps to keep birds from nesting inside. Henrik tried explaining his reasoning to a group at the trading post. He described how warm air would rise into the gable buffer zone, how the trapped air would act as insulation, how the system would prevent the condensation that killed Ronan. The trappers listened politely, but their expressions showed skepticism. The fundamental problem was that Henrik's theory violated common sense. Everyone knew you sealed cabins tight to keep heat inside. Creating intentional gaps seemed like deliberate sabotage of basic shelter principles. One older trapper named Samuel Garrett, who had survived 20 winters in the mountains, simply shook his head and walked away. He had seen young men die from foolish ideas before. Henrik returned to his cabin and continued work. He completed the roof, laying split shingles over birch bark over solid planking. The roof was conventional, built to keep weather out completely. The walls were conventional, chinked carefully with no gaps. Only the gable ends featured the air gap system, and only on the exterior. From inside the cabin, looking up, Henrik saw solid logs, no gaps, no openings, no apparent weakness, but from outside, the gable showed clear spaces between horizontal logs, and through those spaces you could see the inner wall behind. Light would shine through those gaps once he had a fire burning inside. It would look like the cabin was glowing, radiating heat through openings that everyone insisted would make him freeze. Henrik moved into the completed cabin on October 20th, 1842. He spent a week arranging supplies, building interior furniture, and preparing for winter. The fireplace drew well, pulling smoke cleanly up the chimney without backdraft. The door sealed properly. The window shutters fit tight. Everything about the cabin functioned as intended except for the feature everyone considered a fatal flaw. The gable gaps remained open, horizontal spaces between logs that showed clear through to the inner wall. Henrik waited for cold weather to test his theory. The first hard freeze arrived on November 3rd. Temperature dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, cold enough to make most trappers retreat indoors and build up their fires. Henrik lit his fireplace at dusk, using seasoned pine that burned hot and steady. He sat near the fire and watched what happened. The flames heated air in the immediate vicinity. That warm air expanded, became less dense than the surrounding cold air, and rose toward the ceiling, following basic physical principles that required no education to observe. In a standard cabin, that rising warm air would hit the cold roof logs directly, condense immediately, and begin the cycle of moisture and heat loss that plagued every frontier structure. In Henrik's cabin, the warm air rose and hit the solid inner gable wall. It couldn't pass through because the inner wall was completely sealed. But the warmth didn't simply stop there. It transferred through the logs of the inner wall into the 8-inch buffer zone between the inner and outer gable sections. The air in that buffer zone began warming. As it warmed, it expanded and rose within the confined space, creating circulation within the buffer itself. The outer gable logs had gaps, but those gaps didn't create a draft because the air in the buffer zone was already warm. Warm air meeting warm air produced no condensation. The buffer zone became a layer of heated air trapped between the living space and the outside cold. Henrik monitored the cabin temperature through the evening. By full dark, With outside temperature at 12 degrees, the interior remained comfortable enough that he didn't need his heavy coat. The walls showed no condensation. The inner gable wall stayed dry. He placed his hand against the logs of the inner wall near the peak and felt warmth radiating from them. The buffer system was working exactly as he had theorized. At midnight, he stepped outside to observe the cabin from the exterior. What he saw confirmed everything. Light from his fire glowed through the gable gaps, shining through the spaces between the outer logs. The effect made the cabin appear to be radiating warmth, which, in a sense, it was. The buffer zone trapped heated air that would normally be lost, turning it into insulation. Henrik slept comfortably that night under a single blanket. His breathing didn't create condensation on the ceiling. The cabin maintained steady temperature without requiring constant fire feeding. When he woke at dawn, the fire had burned down to coals, but the interior was still warm. The buffer zone retained heat through the night. Robert Ashford's cabin stood 8 miles south of Henrik's location, built on a creek bottom that provided convenient water access and good trapping. The cabin was 5 years old, maintained adequately, and constructed using techniques Ashford had learned from veteran mountain men when he first came west. Every gap was sealed with moss and clay chinking. The door fit snugly in its frame. The single window was covered with oiled canvas stretched tight. Ashford considered it a solid structure that had kept him alive through 5 winters without significant problems. He had rebuilt the roof twice and rechinked the walls each spring, standard maintenance that any competent trapper performed. The cold front that arrived on January 18, 1843, was different from normal winter weather. Temperature dropped to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit by evening and continued falling through the night. Ashford built his fire large, feeding it split pine and aspen, until the flames filled half the fireplace opening. The heat was substantial. Standing within 5 feet of the fire, Ashford felt uncomfortably warm, but the cabin itself remained brutally cold. He wore his heavy coat, fur hat, and wrapped blankets around his shoulders while sitting near the flames. Moving away from the immediate fire zone meant entering air cold enough to see breath forming with each exhale. The condensation started within 2 hours of sunset. Moisture began forming on the ceiling logs, tiny droplets that caught firelight and sparkled like stars. Ashford had seen this countless times before and knew what came next. The droplets would grow, merge, and begin falling. Some would freeze into ice, coating the underside of the roof. The rest would drip onto everything below. He moved his bedding away from the worst drip zones and placed his food supplies under a canvas tarp. By midnight, water was falling steadily from multiple points on the ceiling. Ashford's blankets were damp despite his efforts to protect them. The temperature inside the cabin felt colder than it should, despite the roaring fire consuming wood at an alarming rate. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Ashford noticed his fingers felt numb. He had been sitting close to the fire for hours, yet his extremities were losing sensation. He removed his gloves and held his hands directly toward the flames, trying to restore feeling. The numbness didn't improve. It spread to his toes despite wearing thick wool socks and fur-lined boots. The dampness in the cabin was combining with cold in a way that pulled heat from his body faster than the fire could replace it. Ashford realized he was in serious danger. Frostbite could cost him fingers or toes. Worse, if he fell asleep in these conditions, he might not wake up. The same thing that killed Henrik's partner could kill him. He kept the fire burning through the night, feeding it constantly, fighting to stay awake. By dawn, temperature had dropped to negative 42 degrees. Ashford's fingers were white and senseless. He needed help, and he knew only one trapper within reasonable distance whose cabin might actually be warm enough to save him. Robert Ashford reached Henrik's cabin at 10 o'clock on the morning of January 19th, after 2 hours of difficult travel through snow in negative 38-degree cold. His fingers were wrapped in cloth tucked inside his coat to protect tissue that had already suffered frostbite damage. Henrik saw him approaching from the window and opened the door immediately. The difference in temperature between outside and inside was so dramatic that warm air rushed out in visible clouds, mixing with the frigid exterior atmosphere. Ashford stumbled inside and collapsed near the fireplace. Henrik closed the door and examined his hands. 3 fingers on the left hand showed the white, waxy appearance of serious frostbite. They needed warming, but slowly, or the tissue damage would worsen. Henrik prepared warm water, not hot, and had Ashford soak his hands while explaining what had happened. The condensation, the dampness, the relentless cold, despite a massive fire burning all night. Ashford kept looking around the cabin, noting details. No condensation anywhere, walls dry. The air felt comfortable, not the oppressive dampness of his own shelter. Henrik's fire was moderate, not the inferno Ashford had maintained, yet the cabin was genuinely warm. Ashford stared up at the gable, seeing the solid inner wall from interior perspective, knowing that outside those walls were the gaps everyone had mocked. Those gaps were working. The air gap system was actually keeping the cabin warmer than sealed construction. The cold front persisted for 6 days. Ashford stayed with Henrik because returning to his own cabin meant risking death. During those days, 3 more trappers sought shelter at Henrik's location. Clayton Pierce arrived on the 3rd day, having traveled from his camp 14 miles east. Pierce had lost feeling in both feet overnight and had walked through brutal cold to reach the only cabin he thought might save him. He arrived barely conscious, feet frozen inside his boots. Henrik treated him as best he could, knowing Pierce would likely lose toes regardless of intervention. Thomas Whitmore showed up on the 4th day, his cabin having flooded from condensation melt that saturated everything he owned. His blankets were frozen solid. His food supplies were ruined by moisture. 4 men crowded into Henrik's cabin, which was designed for 1 person. They slept in shifts, sharing the warmth that the air gap system maintained consistently. The fire burned continuously, but didn't require excessive wood consumption. The buffer zone in the gable trapped rising heat and held it, creating an insulation layer that standard cabins couldn't match. Outside temperature reached -50 degrees on the 5th night. Inside Henrik's cabin, the 4 men survived comfortably enough to play cards and tell stories. Pierce's feet were bad, probably beyond saving 2 toes, but he was alive. Ashford's fingers recovered enough that he would keep them, though they remained painful and discolored. When the cold finally broke on the 7th day, the 4 trappers emerged to find 2 cabins in the area had been abandoned. The occupants had fled to lower elevations, unable to survive the cold in their standard construction shelters. Word spread quickly through the scattered mountain community. Dalström's gaps actually worked. The cabin everyone mocked had saved 4 Lees. Spring arrived in April 1843, bringing the thaw that allowed trappers to assess winter damage and begin repairs. Clayton Pierce returned to his cabin site to find the structure uninhabitable. Condensation damage had rotted sections of the roof. Moisture had compromised the structural integrity of corner joints. The cabin needed complete rebuilding rather than repair. Pierce rode to Henrik's location in early May and asked for help, not just labor, but knowledge. He wanted to understand the air gap system and build his own cabin using the same principles. Henrik agreed and spent 2 weeks working with Pierce on the new construction. The process began with Pierce's existing cabin demolition. They salvaged logs that remained sound and cut new timber for sections too damaged to reuse. Henrik explained each step of the air gap design as they worked. The critical element was understanding that 2 separate walls were required at the gable. The inner wall had to be completely solid, sealed thoroughly, creating an airtight barrier between living space and buffer zone. This inner wall was built first, fitted carefully, chinked with the same attention to detail that trappers normally applied to exterior walls. Pierce asked why such care was necessary for a wall that would be hidden inside the gable space. Henrik explained that any gap in the inner wall would allow warm, moist air from the living space to enter the buffer zone directly, creating condensation against the cold outer logs. The inner wall had to be perfect. The outer gable wall was built second, positioned 8 inches away from the inner wall at the base, creating the buffer zone that would trap rising warm air. The outer logs were spaced with measured gaps of 3 inches between each piece. Henrik showed Pierce how to use a spacing stick to maintain consistency. The gaps had to be uniform, or airflow patterns would become unpredictable. Too wide, and the buffer zone wouldn't retain heat effectively. Too narrow, and the system wouldn't allow adequate air circulation within the buffer space. 3 inches was the measurement Henrik had determined through observation and testing during his first winter using the system. Pierce's cabin was completed by late May. It looked peculiar from the exterior, just as Henrik's did, with visible gaps in the gable that appeared to be construction flaws or unfinished work. But Pierce understood the physics now. He knew those gaps were deliberate features, not mistakes. Robert Ashford visited during the final week of construction. He watched Henrik and Pierce installing the outer gable logs with careful spacing and asked detailed questions about the technique. Ashford's frostbitten fingers had healed, but the experience had convinced him that standard cabin construction was inadequate for severe conditions. He announced his intention to rebuild his own cabin using the air gap system before next winter. Word continued spreading through the trapping community. Not every trapper adopted the technique. Some still considered it wasteful of lumber and effort. But those who had faced serious cold, who had lost partners or nearly died themselves, paid attention. They visited Henrik's cabin, examined the construction, asked questions, and began modifying their own structures. The Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed between 1845 and 1848. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in accessible areas, and more significantly, fashion trends in eastern cities shifted away from beaver felt hats toward silk alternatives. The economic foundation that had drawn men into the wilderness disappeared almost overnight. Trappers who had spent years mastering survival skills found their expertise suddenly worthless in market terms. Most left the mountains seeking opportunity in Oregon Territory, California goldfields, or returning to eastern settlements they had abandoned years earlier. Henrik Dalström left in the spring of 1847, selling his trapping equipment and packing what remained of value onto 2 horses. He traveled west to Oregon Territory and purchased land in the Willamette Valley, where former mountain men were establishing farms and ranches. The transition from wilderness survival to agricultural settlement was difficult for many trappers, but Henrik adapted. He understood construction, planning, and solving practical problems through observation and thought. Those skills translated to farming more effectively than wilderness skills. He married in 1849 a widow named Catherine, who had crossed the Oregon Trail 2 years earlier. They had 3 children over the following decade. Henrik never spoke much about his time in the mountains. His family knew he had been a trapper, but he didn't tell stories about bears or hostile encounters or dramatic survival moments. He was a quiet man who built solid structures and solved problems methodically. The cabins remained in the mountains. Henrik's original cabin near the Wind River Range stood empty for 2 years before settlers moving west discovered it. A family named Morrison occupied it through the winter of 1849 and were surprised by how warm it stayed despite brutal cold. They didn't understand the air gap system initially, but they recognized that something about the construction was superior to standard cabins. The Morrison family stayed 5 years, and when they moved on, they told others about the peculiar cabin that kept warm through any weather. Clayton Pierce's cabin was occupied continuously from 1850 through 1865 by various trappers, hunters, and eventually homesteaders. Robert Ashford's reconstructed cabin became a way station for travelers, known among emigrants as a reliable shelter. The technique spread without Henrik's name attached. Settlers and builders who examined the existing cabins recognized the air gap principle and incorporated it into new construction. By 1855, variations of the gable air gap system appeared in cabins throughout Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho territories. Some builders created larger buffer zones. Others experimented with different gap spacing. The specific implementation varied, but the core principle remained consistent. Dead air trapped in a buffer zone provided insulation superior to sealed construction. Rising warm air became an asset rather than a source of heat loss and condensation. Dozens of families survived brutal winters in cabins that incorporated this technique, though most never knew the innovation originated with a Swedish trapper obsessed with understanding why his partner froze to death. Henrik Dalström died in January 1873 at age 61 on his Oregon farm, surrounded by family who mourned a man they loved but never fully understood. His legacy remained carved into logs scattered across the Rocky Mountain frontier, silent proof that engineering could triumph over conditions that defeated strength alone.